was very popular with like left circles, even in the US. And like you can see the influence of Marxist thinking on things like Occupy Wall Street when they talk about the 1% versus the 99%. We've seen a very much a growth in Democratic Socialists of America. And then obviously the Sanders campaign, you know, he's a self-described democratic socialist. And I'm just wondering what you sort of make of this moment. Is it just a trend, or is there like some sort of new phenomenon going on that's sort of driving like, you know, a renewal in like Marxist thinking in what I would call like left progressive liberal circles today?
Yes, I do think it's a new historical moment, definitely, Scott. I trace it to the global financial crisis of 2008-9. And I don't think there's any doubt that that was one of the great historical crises of capitalism. You know, I've tended to say to people, there are three great periods of global crisis within the history of capitalism. There's the so-called original Great Depression of 1873 to 96, which is, you know, very similar to the 1930s in the sense that, you know, this is it's a 2-decade-long crisis of mass unemployment and industrial restructuring and so on. Coming out of the First World War, there's a new economic boom, which then, as you know, crashes in 29. And honestly, that crisis was deepening again after 1937, and only war and rearmament and war economies pulled the world back out. Then in the early 1970s, we go into another period of crisis, which, you know, my own view is it's only resolved with a terrific assault on the working class, which is sort of exemplified by the Volcker shock, where they drive up interest rates essentially to bankrupt the most inefficient corporations and allow major industrial restructuring to happen, and to really go after working class organizations, which Reagan does in the United States, which Margaret Thatcher does by squaring off against the coal miners in Britain, which the Bolivian government does by crushing the most radical union in Latin America, the Tin Miners Union. And so they then get a new boom coming out of that crisis. And I believe that the long expansion of the neoliberal period from the early 1980s is, it starts to break around 2000, 2001, and the Fed basically buys time, massively cutting interest rates in particular. But all that does is build up more and more instabilities for the big crash of 2008-9. I think since that crash of 2008-9, we are in a new period, and Occupy Wall Street represents that new period. The movement of the squares in Europe, I would include the Arab Spring, which is also a movement of the squares in cities like Cairo. That moment symbolizes essentially the detachment of a whole young generation from the system. They realize they're precarious labor and they're downwardly mobile. And the dreams and the promises of post-World War II capitalism are dead in the water. And so that's the context in which, as you know, identification with socialism becomes more and more popular among young people in the United States. And the Sanders campaign picks up on that. It feeds into that and it contributes to it. The growth of the Democratic Socialists of America, for all of the contradictions involved, still represents something significant in this regard. We do have a popularization of the idea of socialism. But I think one of the challenges is that these movements emerged at a moment where mainstream electoralism was widely discredited among millions of people, but in which class struggle from below was really weak. And so a lot of these movements, Podemos in Spain, the DSA in parts of the United States, and so on, found they could kind of insert themselves into the electoral arena and get results disproportionate to their real social weight. You know, it's good that AOC got elected. I think that's wonderful. Ilhan Omar and so on. It's great that there was a left vote developing in countries like Spain, but the problem is that ultimately electoralism is on foreign terrain for the left. You're contesting within their territory where they control the rules and they have the institutional power. By them, I mean the capitalist class. And what you can accomplish there is utterly dependent upon the social mobilization in the streets and workplaces that can sustain your campaigns. And that's been the really weak side of a lot of the new left formations that have come out of this period. So I don't say this, to attack and demean them in a sectarian way or anything like that. But we are going to have to go back to the idea of a left that trains organizers, that builds organizing from the grassroots. People who, and so Bob, your reference to Chris Smalls, for instance, Chris Smalls is a great example of a grassroots labor organizer today. But we need thousands of those organizing in unions, workplaces, and communities. And the overly electoral investments of some of these groups have prevented them from really developing those grassroots organizers. And I think that's going to be the challenge going forward. Because I think some of the thousands of activists are going to recognize they've hit an impasse.
That's something
we have to make it credible that there's another orientation.
No, I'm really proud of that with this podcast.